Hey, ladies and gentlemen, this is Javier Novoa with the Libertarian Investor, and this is why Libertarianism will make you rich. And of course, it's a little more nuanced than that. You need not only libertarian theory, but you also need a firm grasp of economics. And I believe you can get no firmer grasp than rational, actual economics, which is only taught by the Austrian School of Economics. Of course, academic economics is a different animal, and I believe it has no bearing upon reality. It has no bearing in investment returns. In fact, a lot of people might get investment returns despite academic economics. And why is this? Because academic economics over the last 100 years has become simply a field where experts or the insiders taught to themselves, and they do it through garlands of algebra. And it's something that not everybody can understand, but it's based upon an incorrect premise. So you need a firm understanding of economics, and you need libertarian theory. And I'm going to explain to you a little bit why that is. Of course, most libertarians today do subscribe to Austrian economics. And I've been studying Austrian economics. I've also been a libertarian since I was 17. So that's about 23 years. And the basic works in Austrian economics are Ludwig von Mises' Human Action, which is a magnum opus on economics, going from the bare basics to complex theory. And then, of course, Murray Rothbard, who takes Mises' work and expands it into libertarianism and anarcho-capitalism, which means, and he explains this in his work, Man, Economy, and State, and his other great works, that government simply exists upon predation, it exists upon taxation, it does not produce anything. And in fact, as Mises pointed out, as all the Austrian economists point out, and Rothbard develops further, they simply interfere in economic activity and cause disequilibrium. So I believe that these two books, Ludwig von Mises' Human Action and Murray Rothbard, Man, Economy, and State, they will profit you highly if you read them carefully. Take some time to read them, but I believe that they are required reading for any investor. We're going to explain why. First of all, we're going to delve just a little bit into Austrian economic theory and why that actually helps you get rich, why that helps you as an investor. And then we're going to go into pure libertarian theory, and we're going to explain why that helps you as an investor and in life. So, first of all, if you read Mises, if you read Rothbard, Austrian economics is the only school of economics that explicitly recognizes the epistemology of economics is not inductive, it is deductive. And stay with me for a little bit if you don't understand this. See, the majority of economists come from the fields of mathematics and physics. And so they believe that their science is like the physical sciences, which is inductive, which means we observe things from the outside, we do experiments, and then we take the results of those observations and experiments and we make probable propositions as to why that works. So, for example, a scientist will, let's say, roll a ball down a hill and he will measure the velocity of that, and then he will extract some propositions from that. And of course, if you've read Karl Popper and the Philosophy of Science, you know that for a scientific proposition to be valid, it must be falsifiable, which means you can never know that this is a priori certain. And if you've read the news over the past few weeks, you'll see that physicists have been disproving long-held laws of physics because they have the tools now to observe them more meticulously. And so economics, as Mises points out, is not an inductive discipline, it's deductive, which means there are certain things that you have to know to be true simply intuitively before you observe something. And probably intuitively is the wrong word, but it's within our minds. And Mises draws a lot from Kant in that regard, that there are certain categories that when we observe the world, we automatically impose those categories. Of course, Rothbard would have said it differently because he's an Aristotelian. He would say that you observe that and then you deduce those laws, but then you must have those laws to observe something. And I want to explain it just by starting out with what Mises said. He says, praxeology, of course, Mises thought that economics was a branch of a more broad science called praxeology, which is the science of human action. And he said praxeology is a theoretical and systematic, not historical science. And he means that this science does not depend on historical observations. It depends on what it means to be human. Its statements and propositions are not derived from experience. They are, like those of logic and mathematics, a priori, which means they're prior to experience. They're not subject to verification or falsification on the ground of experience and facts. And let me try to explain this simply. If, let's say, a Martian from outer space came and saw someone buying a blanket for a coin, well, if that Martian did not have a human sense of what exchange or trade meant, all he would be able to do is explain it through the laws of physics, that someone handed another person this shiny disc, and another person handed the first person a blanket. But he would not be able to understand what exchange was. And Mises' theory, and what I set forward to you, is that unless we already understood what exchange meant, we could not say that this is an exchange. We can only describe it from the point of view of the laws of physics, the laws of chemistry, and so on. Hope you understand me just a little bit. The basic thing is that economic science is not observed. It has to be elucidated according to laws that are already within logic. What does that mean? That means that the science of economics is the science of the human mind and human logic. What does that mean? It means that it can't be explained like mathematics or physics. And that is the main problem with modern economics, and by extension, modern investment and so on, because they're not taking into account the human element. And I can talk about something right off the bat that has to do with investing. If you look at, I believe his name was Machiel, and he was an economist and a theorist of investing. He wrote this book, A Random Walk Down Wall Street. And his theory is markets are efficient. So everything that can be known about a stock is priced into the stock. Therefore, you cannot buy a stock cheaply. And therefore, according to his theory, statistically, you can't make money in the stock market. But if you look at people like Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger and others, they consistently make 20, 30, 40% returns. Shoot, if you look at people like Chris Camillo, they consistently make 70% returns compounded. Of course, the more money you get, the harder it is to do that. You understand why. But his theory is simply disproven by observation. There are people who consistently make money in stocks. But if you believe like they do, and it's based upon this mathematical theory that the market is a machine, I think it comes out of this epistemology that economics is a physical science. And that comes from the epistemology that we can't know economic law unless we observe it. So this in itself, guys, makes you stupid. In fact, I remember Gary North, who was a great Austrian economist who passed away a few years ago. He said that Keynesianism makes you stupid. And it's a knowledge of Austrian economics that's going to make you intelligent in these markets, and it's going to make you rich. The next aspect, I believe, if you study Austrian economics, you'll have a huge jump on most investors and just most normal people, is that Austrian economics, and I know other economic systems do this, but Austrian economics explicitly talks about what we call methodological singularism. And that means that when looking at institutions, when looking at groups, when looking at parties, let's say the Republican or the Democratic parties, when looking at a country like America, Canada, Russia, we have to, in order to understand what's really going on, whittle those down to their singular and individual components. And what is that? What is the most finely, shall we say, reduced element of all of these systems? It's human beings. And that's why Mises calls his book human action, it is not the action of a country or the action of a party or the action of a group, because those can't act. Those are all composed of human beings. So if we want to understand what's really going on in economic policy, in financial news, we have to understand who the actors are. The actors are individual human beings. Here's why this is important. When Trump levies tariffs, which have been disproven hundreds of years ago by Ricardo, by some of the greatest economists in history, they've been proved that they cause economic disequilibrium, that they harm the majority of the populations. But Trump says this benefits America. America is making a trade deal with China. America is making a trade deal with Canada. But these countries do not exist as entities on their own. If you study Austrian economics, what is America? It is simply an agglomeration of millions of individuals. And of course, hundreds of groups and thousands of groups. These groups are composed of individuals. So when Trump says the tariffs will benefit America, what does he actually mean? He means they will benefit certain people. Then we look, okay, who benefits? And then you're able to make rational investment decisions. Oh, well, if there's a tariff on steel, companies that produce steel in the U.S. will benefit. Therefore, perhaps I might invest in a steel company, or I might buy options in this. You understand? This really helps you. Whereas if you think tariffs are going to benefit America, you're going to make huge mistakes. That is one of the greatest insights that you get in studying Austrian economics. Probably the greatest insight that you'll get is the business cycle as an investor. And I know a lot of people talk about the business cycle. In fact, Ray Dalio, who's the billionaire head of one of the greatest hedge funds in history, had a video on how the economy works, and it's basically talking about the business cycle. And the ones who described the business cycle first were Austrian economists, and Mises describes it. And I want to give you just a short paragraph in his book talking about the business cycle. Or rather, he talks about it in his book. Murray Rothbard describes it very elegantly, and this is from his book, America's Great Depression. Remember, Murray Rothbard was a student of Mises, and he's the one that took Austrian economics and put it on this not only Aristotelian, logical, rational path, but also on this path of that the state is actually contrary to human liberty and to economic liberty. But he says, Rothbard here, the business cycle is generated by the expansion of bank credit, which is created out of thin air by the banking system. This credit expansion falsifies the signals of the market and leads businessmen to invest in projects that cannot be sustained by the real savings of the public. The boom, therefore, is not genuine prosperity, but a period of wasteful investment. The inevitable result is the bust when the market reasserts itself and liquidates the malinvestments of the boom. In another closely related passage, Rothbard says, the boom is not the recovery. It is the disease itself. So when the economy is booming, it's not the recovery. We're going to explain it a little bit here. The depression is the necessary process by which the economy adjusts to the distortions of the boom and returns to a sound relationship between production and consumer preferences. So why does President Trump want to fire the Fed's chief or allow his term to lapse and then put someone in there who he wants? Because they're going to lower interest rates. But if you understand the theory of the business cycle, when the government artificially lowers interest rates, the Fed does, that causes business owners, because there's more money in the economy and the interest rates are lower, business owners think that people have a higher time preference. They think that people are able to save and buy more goods in more time. So what do? They invest more. They invest more in property and capital and productive equipment, and then they produce all of these goods that they think are demanded. But what happens? The demand is not actually there. And furthermore, all this new money in the economy goes in, and the Cantillon effect happens, which means that the first people who get that money buy assets, the prices go up. But by the time it gets to me and you, by the time it gets to people on fixed income, the prices are already too expensive and they can't buy it. So it makes them poor. This is what's going on, by the way, with housing prices and why nobody can afford anything. So when the business owners realize that there's not demand for their product, they have to contract. They have to sell stuff. Many of them go bankrupt and out of business. This is when the depression happens. But the depression and the recession are not bad. It's actually like the fever. It's going in and washing out the negative aspects so that we can start on a good footing. But the government never wants that to happen because they know that when that happens on their watch, they get the blame. When you understand this, you can take steps as an investor. When you see stocks artificially high like they are, people are saying, well, the stock market needs to keep going up. It's up. If you look at companies now, most of them have 20, 30, 40, 100 PE ratios. And traditionally, as an investor, you're taught that you don't want to really buy anything for long-term investment that's over a 10 PE ratio. Even some great investors say try to find companies for a PE ratio of 1. Why are stocks artificially heightened? Why is there an AI bubble? People are still thinking, well, we need to invest in NVIDIA when it is at a huge PE ratio. If you understand the business cycle, you will understand every bubble. You will understand why the markets work as they do. And this takes me to a very important aspect of how Austrian economics will help you understand what's going on. That is the AI problem. Many people are warning AI is going to take away every job. AI is going to replace 80% of the jobs, and there's just going to be no income. And I would point them to the time when we changed from horses and carriages to cars. Well, it's going to put everybody out of business. Sure, it put a lot of people out of business, but more and other jobs were created and people were able to switch. The same thing with AI. But the fundamental fallacy here is not understanding that producers and consumers drive the economy. So if AI, let's just theoretically talk about it very quickly. If AI is producing all of these goods for lower prices, and they no longer need people to produce these goods, so they lay off people, and people have no money, well, then they're not going to be able to sell any of these goods. So they're going to have to either lower their prices or go out of business. And what's going to happen eventually is an equilibrium. Either you're going to get everything for free, or it is not the case that AI is going to destroy every single income opportunity. Another fallacy that Mises talks about is employment. We're not really concerned about full employment as the Keynesians are. What we're concerned about is income. So if someone can receive income without employment, that's great. It's not employment, it's actually resources flowing to people, and then they're able to buy other resources with it. That's what's important in the economy. So do not be fooled by these smoke and mirrors that are generated by people who simply don't understand Austrian economics. That's another reason why Austrian economics is going to be very helpful to you in investing. Another aspect of this, knowing what money is. People think that money arose from government fiat, but if you study Menger and the Austrian economists, you'll realize that money arose spontaneously by, through barter. And then people realized that barter was inefficient, and so they started buying goods in anticipation of the fact that those goods were going to be demanded by more people. And we'll make another video on this, but gold and silver has arisen historically, or have arisen historically, as the two forms of money that spontaneously arose. Read the Bible. It talks about gold ingots before they even made coins. So it was a historical and anarchic form of money. And that's why Austrians know that eventually fiat money goes to zero. And I started investing in silver almost 20 years ago. And right now I'm seeing the biggest returns of my life in silver. If you know Austrian economics, you will know when to invest in metals, when to invest in gold, when to invest in silver. Many great investors like Warren Buffett discouraged gold, eschewed gold, because they thought, rightly so, that gold does not yield any sort of income. But what they did not realized was that gold serves as a great hedge because all government money is going to zero. And you would know this if you knew Austrian economics. Now, going on to pure libertarianism, what is libertarianism? And it is simply this. It is a tradition or cluster of traditions that is rooted in Enlightenment philosophy. It's rooted in classical liberalism, but it was really developed and perfected here in America. And it is based upon simply this, the proposition of non-aggression, that life is sacred and property which arises from man's life and man's intellect is sacred. And therefore, violence is not allowed to be initiated against another human being, neither in his life nor in his property. Therefore, it is radical, personal freedom. And of course, a lot of philosophy comes out of that benefits you in your individual life. It gives you permission to focus on yourself. It gives you permission to be selfish. In fact, Ayn Rand wrote a book. She wouldn't describe herself as a libertarian, but many libertarians are influenced by her. She wrote a book called The Virtue of Selfishness. And what libertarianism teaches you to do is, number one, be selfish enough to design your own life without giving a damn what other people think. And there's a great book by Harry Browne, who was a libertarian candidate for president, called How I Found Freedom in an Unfree World. I'd recommend all of you buy that book and read that book or get it, because it will give you the psychological and interior skills necessary to be a great investor, to be someone who goes off and lives on your own terms, not really caring about what other people think. The second major aspect of this is that libertarianism inculcates in you a skepticism of governments. And I probably should have described this when I was talking about Mises, but first of all, a skepticism of government numbers. Governments lie. I remember when President Trump ran for president, he talked about how all of these numbers from the Bureau of Labor Statistics were lies, but now he's putting out these lies, and he is demanding that you assent to these lies. Of course, power corrupts everybody. You're suspicious always of what comes out of government. You're suspicious of what comes out of official sources. So, and we talked about this with methodological singularism. When Trump says, I'm benefiting America by this, America's going to benefit from the invasion of Venezuela. Venezuela's going to benefit. Really? How? It's the broken window fallacy. If you look at Bastiat, who was a great economist and classical liberal, he talks about the fact that people say that war helps the economy. And he talks about the fact how if someone throws a rock at the baker's window, it's good for the economy because he then has to pay the window maker. But what we don't see when we analyze economics this way are the unseen costs. That baker was going to buy a suit. That baker was going to spend his money on something else. All of the unseen costs go by the wayside. What are the unseen costs of war and regime change and so on and so forth? As a libertarian, you will be able to see this. You'll be suspicious always of any monetary numbers or any financial numbers or economic numbers, like, for example, gross domestic product. That's all a lie. How are you going to take the total of monetary inflows and aggregate that into a total and then say that means something? Again, because as you've studied Austrian economics, you know that actions are taken by individuals. How can we aggregate all of the individual actions of a country, or all of the individual incomes of a country, into this one number? How can we say that inflation is 6%? Now they're saying that inflation is 6%, but they're not including the stock market. They're not including the rise in price of luxury goods. They're not including a lot of things. Inflation is probably more like 20 to 30%. But as Mises talks about, you cannot really describe inflation as a number because these are simply aggregates of numbers that really mean nothing. Do you understand what I'm saying? You start to actually see things for what they are. What does that help you do as an investor? Well, it makes you more prone to doing your own research and actually trying to research things that you can verify, as opposed to simply looking at a whole company and saying, oh, the company's doing this. No, you'll segment that company into pieces and you'll research the goings on of each of those pieces. You're more likely to do that. So this is why libertarianism makes you intelligent. Libertarian, even though Mises says you cannot predict, look at my videos. I've predicted so many things. I predicted Omeros stock going up. I've predicted silver was going to go way up. Why? Because I know basic economic law, and over time, just due to the laws of probability, you're going to be right, all things being equal. So this is why libertarianism makes you intelligent. Study Mises, study Rothbard. If you like our videos, please do subscribe, like the channel. We're going to be releasing weekly videos on libertarian investing, on geopolitical investing, which is my favorite form, but also other forms of investing, trading, and we will let you know what we're doing. So until very soon, guys, this is Javier. Stay tuned.